Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I trust you had a great break. I also trust that you have found these sessions so far valuable. Next up, we've got Marcus Krebs all the way from the UK. First, I want to just ask you a few questions, Marcus. Thank you for joining us. How are you keeping today?
Too bad. It's been a busy month. In fact, it's been a busy year. I was hoping it might quieten down a little bit, but I think since the arrival of ChatGPT and some of the other generative AI flavors, it's been pretty busy, and I can see it being like that for a considerable time. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, we thank you for joining us all the way from London. Marcus, if people ask you at a cocktail party, what do you do? And you only have 1 or 2 minutes. I know this is an impossible question, but how would you answer that question?
Good question. I guess in a professional setting, I would give you a very quick rundown, elevator pitch of my professional background. So my background is really 30 years in banking, financial institutions, all different flavors, consumer retail banking, wholesale investment, and so on, and more than 20 years in risk management. I would say I'm not an AI expert, but what I do focus on is, and have been for a while, is actually conduct risk, embedding the right culture, the right behaviors. And over the time, this has also evolved into looking into what AI can do to augment human activities, but at the same time, what are some of the risks that are out there? Privately or as a hobby, I also use a little bit AI. I fly drones and I enhance them or augment them with additional AI, turning them into flying robots, collecting AL data. I do a lot of different things and wear quite a few different hats. So best way to find out is probably jumping on LinkedIn. Otherwise, we'd be here all day, and that's not the purpose of today's session.
Just one last question before I hand over to you, Marcus. Regulation often follows some sort of tragedy of sorts, something that really went wrong. If we think of seat belts, too many people started dying in car crashes in the early days, and they had to regulate and make laws around seat belts. Can we afford something really bad to go wrong, and what might that be for a lot more regulatory work in the AI space? Now, there are things, there's good positive things happening around the AI Act in the EU that we're looking forward to, etc. But must it really go bad? And what might that go bad look like?
So two things I think really concern me. Having seen how regulation works in the banking and financial services world, particularly operational risk, it takes an awful long time to develop this at Basel level, Bank of International Settlements, and then roll it out. So for instance, if you look at Nick Leeson, when Banks Bank went down, that was in, I think, 1995. And it wasn't until 2004 or 2005 until the last iteration of Basel actually came out and applied to banks globally. In this space, in the dynamic AI development world, we cannot afford any delays at that sort of level. So that's one concern. The other one is, and that's also, I guess, an overlap with financial institutions and technology generally, is AI is a borderless issue. It's a global issue. It's not going to stop anywhere. You can't contain it in South Africa. You can't contain it in Europe. You can't contain it in the US, in China, or anywhere else. So that means automatically any regulation that is being developed needs to come right from the top, United Nations level, for instance, and I've been quite active in this space. It needs to roll out globally, and it needs to be coordinated and aligned. If that doesn't happen, then ultimately we will end up with something similar we've seen in the banking world prior to the global financial crisis, which is regulatory arbitrage by the big tech companies and the corps. Now, from a risk perspective, yes, I am at heart a risk manager, but I like to look at both upside and downside of risks. I think there are huge opportunities. We heard a little bit during your session earlier on, and also what Akiva said, how work life can be rebalanced, I guess, how we can remove the robot out of the human and become more creative. However, if I look at this as a risk manager, I need to think, what's the base case, what's the best case, what's the worst case. The worst case is existential risk for humanity. There's a lot of talk about that, but ultimately it might actually look quite different than what people have in mind. And then, what's the base case? I think the base case will be that life is going to change fundamentally for everyone, certainly everyone involved with processes, procedures, technologies, companies. Unless you're completely isolated on an island, you're going to be impacted by this. One of the biggest challenges here is, of course, it's not necessarily technology. The technology just amplifies human behaviors and patterns. The biggest challenge, I think, is that humans, to this date, humanity has not solved to live with each other peacefully, whether or not we look at technologies such as AI or not. Until we overcome this, I think there's a big danger that AI amplifies and accelerates conflicts across the globe, and potentially at a borderless level where they become not easily containable anymore. That's my biggest concern at this point.
I think a lot of people don't realize what serious stuff this is that we are talking about. It's not just the tech and the bells and whistles. We really are talking about the future of our children and their children and beyond. Markus, I really look forward to your presentation. A quick reminder to our delegates, if you have any questions, please add it into the platform. We would love to get to as many of them as we can. And with that, Markus, I really look forward to hearing you, and I'm handing over to you now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Let me see if the slides are coming up. Hopefully you can see this now. So this was actually a topic task that was set for me by FlameStation, and I looked at it and I thought, okay, now how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to break this down? My background is in financial services, a long time working on structured finance and structured transactions. And one way of doing that is really breaking down the thinking into digestible blocks. And that's exactly what I've been doing here. I've been trying to look at ethical and responsible use of AI by applying this, way of thinking, this thinking framework of the whens, the whys, the who's, the what's, the how's, the where's. And what I mean by that is, let's go here. So not necessarily in this order, but what I would like to cover today are the what's of ethical AI, responsible AI. So the key thematics, contextual and strategic setting, evolution of AI principles, because they are a very important backdrop to all of this, references and further information, org-wide embedment and agency, and also give you some real tools to implement that, because ethics and responsibility, particular ethics, I think, is a very moldable, it's a bit like blue jelly. It's very moldable and very difficult to grasp, actually. So in order to do that, we need to come up with some thought frameworks, but also some contextual and thematical frameworks that then help you to implement that, both from a institutional perspective, but also understanding what is the contextual setting, what is the regulatory environment going to look like. So let's start with a question, really. And the question here is, what are the risks? What is the contextual and strategic setting that is required, the thinking at an organizational level to implement AI in an ethical and responsible way? And by the way, you will be getting a link to this sort of interactive presentation. There's an awful lot of reference materials in the back that I've included for you. So hopefully you'll be able to go on there and check them out for yourself. But this is really structuring my thinking for you in this place. Now, we heard early on from Kiva, I think it was, I can't remember the number, it was either 82 or 80% of all AI projects within organizations fail. And I'm at heart a risk manager, and I'm trying to understand what are the fundamental risks by deploying such a powerful and dynamic technology. And one way of doing that is really looking at some of the artificial intelligence databases that are out there. So this one is in the reference as well as a link, but this is called the AI Incident Database. And when I looked the other day, there are currently more than 3,000 incidents recorded. I sort of tried to break them down further in terms of risk buckets or risk taxonomy, what could actually go wrong. And we can start here. If you think AI cannot kill you or damage infrastructure, then actually that would be wrong. This is one of the early articles I found actually in that database. All the other ones are relatively new, but this one is an example about destruction of infrastructure and or death of some of the persons involved. So that is serious. And if you as an organization are considering to implement AI in your overall business model, you must give considerations to some of these serious risks. But then again, as a consumer of everyday items, most things you get these days, whether it is your smartphone, whether it is an Amazon Alexa, Google Home Hub, anything you can think of these days really has got embedded AI and is increasingly becoming an Internet of Things item. Now, you may not think necessarily these can cause harm, but here's an example where a GPS unit simply sent travelers the wrong way. And that's just one of the many examples that is out there where embedded AI can go wrong. But AI cannot just impact our physical lives, it also can take control and abuse potentially our online profiles, whether that is social media profiles, whether that is some bank account access, whether it is taking on deep fake identities and trying to get access to your wealth products. So from an insurance and from a banking perspective, we need to be mindful of all of these things. Then the next one here is, and we're moving away a little bit from the social media, but there's of course an overlap here as well. The next one is something we have recently seen increasingly happening with the advent of generative AI, and whether that's ChatGPT, Google Bard, or another tool, it doesn't really matter. But there is a real risk here that our human thought, our human intelligence is being manipulated by the AI to a point where we don't necessarily recognize it, or by the point we recognize it, it might be too late. And there have been several reported suicides around the globe since the arrival of ChatGPT. That has clearly impacted humans' behavior to the point where they've given up. And this is just one of these sad examples, unfortunately. Now, in terms of manipulation, it could be individual manipulation, but it also could be much wider on a bulk and wholesale basis. If you think about a few years ago, I think one of the tools that was used to manipulate the markets was Twitter, where someone tweeted saying the White House was attacked, and I think Barack Obama got badly injured, and the markets responded to that, and not necessarily just the human traders in the banks and the financial institutions, but also the algorithmic trading platforms were kicking in. And back at that point, this goes back a while now, there weren't any particular circuit breakers built into this technology. And as a result, we have seen financial markets respond to it. Now, technology has moved on. We have increasingly interconnectivity globally, but that means we could come across, generated images of some event happening that impact what the markets are doing. And then in this case, it turned out this was actually an AI-generated image of the Pentagon explosion. I can't remember when this was, also May, so not that long ago. But we are being confronted, and as an organization or from a business perspective, what we are trying to do is we're trying to make informed decisions. Now, that is getting increasingly difficult because we don't know if the decision we're going to make is a true informed decision or a manipulated, a fake, deep fake based, AI generated, image based decision. So the question is, and how can we verify that from an organizational point of view? Is it sometimes good? And I think it was a keyword who mentioned Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Sometimes it's actually good to deliberately either do nothing, which by the way is also doing something from a conduct risk perspective, and sit back and observe a little bit and think before taking sort of flip decisions that might turn on their head and turn out to be a huge risk. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, I do fly autonomous drones, or I build and program autonomous drones with AI. These drones are really small. If they crash, nothing really happens. No real damage being done. However, in the case of autonomous cars and self-driving vehicles, we have seen an awful lot of fatalities and crashes. I think the latest one I've come across was a Tesla going over a cliff somewhere in California and killing the whole family that was inside. It's awful. And if we rely on this technology and trust them with our lives, then we need to be aware of the risks that are involved into all of this. Then we have seen a variety of cases where users, consumers, in particular vulnerable users, so in particular teenagers with eating disorders in this case, have been exploited by the AI. Now, not deliberately, that probably was an error, but there was a National Eating Disorder Association that used an AI chatbot, and the AI chatbot, no idea what its data source was, but it basically went rogue and provided the wrong advice to a lot of these vulnerable people. And that's wrong. We need to be mindful of these risks, and we need to be aware how that can impact people's behaviors. So I think it was something Akiva also said early on. As an organization, when we implement all this stuff, we need to think about the strategic objectives. And I'll come to that specifically in a little while. But also, there seems to be an inherent trust that we trust the big tech companies, the Googles, the Metas, the Twitters, or X's, as it's called now, of this world, that they would have all the ethical behavior and ethical teams and responses built into all these tools that are putting out there into the market. Now, unfortunately, particularly in times where technology is coming under financial pressures and funding pressures, it turns out a lot of the ethical teams were the ones that were made redundant first. And that, I think, says two things. First of all, we shouldn't be trusting these technology companies. We should be doing our own independent verification when we deploy some of the tools they are putting out there, often for free, I should say. And obviously, when they put out a tool for free, then the product is ultimately the user, all of us. So we got to be mindful of that. And the other point is we need to embed ethical behaviors in organizations across the globe, particularly if they're developing this kind of stuff and putting it out in the market. So we need to be very mindful of that. And I think a lot of work needs doing. A little bit more general now from a risk perspective. I think often when we talk about AI, we talk about bias that's built into the system. And often what we've seen is AI actually amplifies human biases and prejudices, such as in this case. And again, we need to be mindful of that, what impact that can have on society. Similarly to here, the greater societal impact, it does threaten democracies, we got a midterm election in the US coming up in 2024. There's elections around the globe. How is AI being used? And have we actually learned from Cambridge Analytica? I don't think we have. So the question is now, how is AI being used to influence opinion and ultimately, how people tick at the ballot box? And then more generally, we need to be mindful of, and I think it was either Akiva or Johan who said this earlier on as well, the more that AI becomes integrated in our lives and the more it actually gains agency over physical objects, whether that's a self-driving car or a drone. At some point we might have household robots or robots for elderly care. We need to be mindful that when these things are deployed, there is the risk for harm, both physical and mental well-being, and for injuries as well as death. And I think we will see increasing cases of those, so we need to be mindful of them. Now, this was the perspective from, what can go wrong. So the question is then, how do risk managers think about the AI within their organizations? And what I'd like to share with you is a brand new survey that came out, I think, a couple of weeks ago from the World Economic Forum. Probably not necessarily statistically representative, because I think they only asked 24, 25 chief risk officers, or only got 24 responses. But still, this is quite interesting, I think, because they were asking these chief risk officers from some rather big global companies across different sectors. They were asking them, do you expect a material impact of AI on business areas in 2023? And if so, which? And you can see here magnified, the response by these CIOs was, yes, we do expect an impact on the business model. 72% actually said that. We do expect a huge impact on the operating model, again, 72%. And the financial model, I guess, in most organizations is something that requires longer term to adjust and amend over time. And as a result of this, this was, less impact, but still almost half of them came back and said, yep, it's going to impact that. Now, the second question they asked them, which is equally interesting, was in the perspective of the chief risk officer, is the development and deployment of these technologies outpacing the management of the ethical and societal risks? And interestingly here is, I think there is a recognition by most of them where they say, yes, ethical societal risks posed by AI technologies are actually outpacing them, but we also understanding what they are. So it sounds like the understanding there is a need to address it. However, it's moving rather quickly, and we should potentially consider slowing some of this down. I think realistically that's not going to happen, despite that letter that was put out there a few months ago. So that is going to continue. Which then really brings me to the last question. Do you think the development of regulation and guardrails needs to be accelerated? And yes, similar to what I said at the beginning, one of the big risks is really that regulation in this space is falling behind, and the large majority of 91% here felt similarly. It needs to speed up, and it also needs to be globally coordinated, because otherwise it's rather pointless, to be honest. So this was something that Akiva mentioned in his session. He was talking about key strategic objectives, particularly with a focus from implementing AI within the business. I'd like to take a step up or two and would say these two questions, they apply to any organization. It doesn't matter if it's a corporate, if it's a not-for-profit, if it's a university, if it's a government body, public service body. But really the question is, ultimately we should ask us, what are the two most important key strategic objectives of any organization? And it ultimately comes back to two. But it's interesting when you ask these questions to CEOs, particularly of corporates, they usually say, oh, stakeholder value, shareholder value, profit, that kind of stuff. So financial incentivization. I would argue something different, and that applies both to the individual organization, but also in the context of today's AI-FERENCE, you could argue it also applies somewhat to humanity at large. And the first thing that comes to mind here is really survival. As an organization, as a race, as humanity, we want to survive. We are faced with emergencies out there. We're seeing the impact that climate change is having across the globe. I think I listened to a session from Mo Gardat the other day, and the link is also in the references. He was talking about, if you think climate change is going to be bad, wait for artificial intelligence if it's not being kept intact. So the first one is really survival, the going concern of the organization and the going concern of humanity at large. But that's not good enough, because if you just survive, chances are, there isn't going to be water, there isn't going to be electricity, there isn't whatever, no utilities available. We need a bit more than that. So really what we want to strive for is, as an organization and as humanity, we want to ensure survival, but with a long-term sustainable benefit. Now, I usually use this slide in a risk management context. And when I talk to corporate organizations, I say, I understand you need to make some profit. So you could argue there's a long-term sustainable profit, both in terms of financial, but in terms of reputational impact. How is the society considering and looking at you as an organization? If you're an NGO, if you're a public service body, if you're a government, then the long-term sustainable benefit will really be a societal benefit, a benefit for the greater good. But regardless of that, these are very important key strategic objectives. If you don't implement them, you kind of, you're lost, because the alternative is death, ultimately, long-term or short-term death. So these are very, very important. That was the sort of introduction and the why. Now the question is then, let's go to when. When did this all start? When do we need to implement that? And in order to do that, I want to take you on a quick journey really through AI ethics evolution, because that's what today's my presentation is ultimately about. So when I look at the global ethics development timeline, and I put there TBC because ultimately this continues, it's never going to stop. And artificial intelligence as a technology has been around for a good 70 years now. So that's not particularly new either. So we need to find a starting point for what I would call the sort of modern AI ethics development. And that really starts in early 2017 with the Asilomar, so-called Asilomar AI principles by the Future of Life Institute. Basically, they put a letter out. This was 23 principles. They were signed by a lot of prominent people, including Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk signed them as well, Bill Gates and others. And then over time, they have developed further on. And then I think from an international regulatory and governance perspective, there's another one that's also equally important, which is the principles of AI from the OECD. And I think there's a revised version just about to come out or has come out recently. So these are all the sort of external AI ethics guidelines that are currently there, and they're all listed in the slides when you get them. Now, coming back to what I think it was Oscar at the beginning, and then also what Johan said, my background is, I wear quite a few hats, and since 2013, I've been an advisor to the United Nations in the risk management of regulatory systems space, which is covering across a whole range of areas, including disaster recovery, pandemic crisis response, pandemic risk management, cybersecurity of autonomous vehicles. And in November 2020, within my UN grouping there, I tabled an initiative suggesting we need to come up with a global regulatory recommendation, some kind of soft law around AI, because if you don't do that, then there's really an existential risk for humanity. Now, luckily, that was taken on board, and we developed internally what we called AI and our tech regulatory initiative. So that includes artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, and robotics, because I think it's important to recognize AI on its own is usually connected to something, or increasingly connected to something. That could either be a industrial robot, it could be a retail consumer type robot, but it also could be increasingly devices that you attach to your body, whether that's a Fitbit, an Apple sports watch, or whatever they're called, or some kind of sensors even that read the brain activity and pulse and other biological factors. So over time, you can see we developed this internally, but I kind of hit a bit of a wall because I had some scope constraints. And as a result of that, this was then earlier this year elevated at what is known as WP6, Working Party 6 level. In a formal project, I developed with an international expert team, a white paper on a recommendation for the United Nations that went through a whole administrative, bureaucratic procedure, including a public consultation and public review that closed in 10th of July. And the paper that's now being prepared will go to the United Nations annual session in November 2023. And it also includes actually a comment about autonomous weapons, which is something where there isn't any international agreement yet. So it remains to be seen what comes out of that. There's different options we're suggesting, but it could be something along the lines of a United Nations treaty or convention, particularly on a focus on AI embedded within products and other digital technologies embedded within products, but that covers a whole range. It could be a UN declaration, UN recommendation, or some kind of other common regulatory framework. That is something for the 193 governments to decide and the member states of the UN, but we've put the foundations in place to doing something along these lines. Now, we talked about the when and the timeline. Let's have a little bit look at the what. So what are the key thematics that should be covered when you are considering ethics and responsible AI with a new organization? As I said at the beginning, this is it's a bit like blue jelly. It's quite moldable and quite shapeable, and putting it in a framework is a bit of a challenge. But because I do also academic work, I've looked at some of the work that has been done previously, and lucky enough, I don't think we need to necessarily reinvent the wheel. There is a good, what I would call, ethics baseline foundation out there, and that is based on, particularly on this paper, which summarizes research that has been done in this space over the last few years. I think it's 38, possibly more than 38 papers. And you can see the sort of 8 building blocks from a thematics and ethical perspective that feed into that. I've listed them out here, and I'll go briefly through some of them, maybe not all of them. So from a privacy angle, you can see, it's important to get the consent of the user. The user should ultimately have the control over the use of the data. There needs to be an ability to restrict the processing by the data processor. There needs to be a right to erasure and the right to be forgotten by the organization. There's a lot of talk out there in the market about privacy by design. So how can we build this in? And privacy in particular is a strong element, whether you look at the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, I think the United States are waking up to the fact that personal data is very, very important. Think about TikTok, think about some of the other Chinese organizations that are facing increasing scrutiny in the US. Then, of course, accountability. So as an organization using AI, you should be accountable to your users. That includes things like impact assessments. It also looks at environmental responsibility, liability, and legal responsibility. So even if you haven't got necessarily AI-specific regulation in your country yet, you will have data protection requirements, you will have other legal requirements, how that data is being handled. And as a result, you as an organization are actually will be held accountable if things go wrong. And we've seen in the past that can be, I can't remember how big the fine was for Meta early in the year, I think it was 1.3 billion. So these fines, particularly under GDPR and under some of the European regulation, which by the way applies globally, are fundamental and are substantial, and you need to be mindful of that. Safety and security, I think, is an important aspect. And coming back to the risks that are highlighted to you early on, including some of the harms and including death, risk to infrastructure, this all needs to be built in. And security by design and security in general is an important theme that all of us as users of AI and producers of AI should consider. Transparency and explainability is not necessarily something new. So we've seen this particularly in financial products. Imagine you are a mortgagee, you go to your bank or you want to get an insurance from your company, and you want to understand how the pricing is calculated, why your credit score is a certain level. So there needs to be an ability to understand what the AI has done and how they arrived at a credit score. It needs to be explainable. And also as a user, you need to have the right to request that information from the organization. Regulatory reporting is equally important. Something that comes to mind is, I think OpenAI put out a message last week or the week before saying they cannot anymore determine whether information provided by ChatGPT has been derived somewhere from the internet or whether it has been hallucinated or made up by ChatGPT. Now, that is important because if you in future are dealing with chatbots, with people, you're thinking you're dealing with people, but you're actually not dealing with people, you're dealing with an AI. At least I would like to know who am I dealing with. And my son, he's 19 now, he's learning cybersecurity, and he was showing me an app from Apple the other day. It takes about 20 minutes to learn or train the AI, but once he's done that, he can put a text input into his phone, and the text then speaks like he speaks, and the similarities are ridiculously. It really concerned me because we've seen this being used for fraud cases, particularly in the US, and I can see an increasing rise of using AI in such fashion. So as such, we need to have that trusted relationship and understand who we're dealing with. And if we haven't got transparency and explainability, we won't be able to do that. Then we've got very, very important fairness and non-discrimination. So the AI should treat everyone equal, and we've seen in the past that hasn't happened. If you're familiar with the film Coded Bias, you will have seen how this works out or not in that case. If you haven't watched the film, I'll put the YouTube link in the reference. It's well worth checking out. So we need to have an inclusiveness in design and in impact built into all of the stuff we're using. Human control, that is probably one of the most important ones. And I think Akiva and also Johan mentioned this early on. Ultimately, we should always be in a final position to say yes or no. And I'm not just talking about autonomous weapons or control of nuclear weapons. I'm talking about everything where's AI being used. We must ultimately stay in control of the technology. If we do give that up, then AI ultimately will take over. And that ties in also with professional responsibility. As an organization, we are responsible for the products and the tools we are providing to our customers and putting out there. And coming back to the informed decision making, you only can make the informed decisions if the tool is actually accurate in the predictions, in the measurements that's making. So there needs to be some sort of integrity built in, and multi-stakeholder collaboration is equally important. So whenever you put something out, you should consult with your ultimate user base of this tool, and not just not just put it upon them and say, well, here you go, you deal with it. That's not good enough. And obviously here, consideration of long-term effects that ties in with this long-term sustainable benefit I mentioned earlier on. Promotion of human values, often referred to as human-centered AI, I think is getting increasingly important, because ultimately, Akiva was talking about the pre-mortem. I usually call it the beginning with the end in mind. The question is really, ultimately, why are we doing this, and what is the benefit both for us as an organization, but also what is the benefit to the individual user, the consumer, but ultimately, what is the benefit to the societal impact overall. If we forget that, there's a huge reputational risk, regulatory implications also. The question is then really coming from this sort of a little bit academic piece of work. I said earlier on, there isn't actually anything aligned out there globally yet. The only thing that is out there from a global policy recommendations perspective is the UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And I tried to compare that a little bit with the sort of 8 pillars that I just shared with you and what the differences are. You can see here the differences are highlighted. So the white ones are fairly similar to what I just showed you, but because the UNESCO is, of course, human rights centered, they will also focus on multi-stakeholder adaptive governance, collaboration, sustainability, in particular the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are very important, as well as awareness and literacy, and proportionality and do no harm. That reminds me of something also Akiva said earlier on. There is a bit of a danger here, because AI could go 2 ways. It could make services more accessible and more distributed, but at the same time, it also could increase the digital divide, and that means some people will be cut out from access to technology, from access to products, and we need to keep this in mind. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's worthwhile taking a look at UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of AI when you're trying to implement this within your organization, because there's some very valid points in here that are worthwhile considering. So that was the what. Let's talk a little bit about the who. So who are the users of ethical and responsible AI, and who is responsible for implementing it within your organization? And ultimately, the answer to this is, and if I take my risk manager's hat and look at the 3 lines of defense model, I would argue the risk is owned by everyone, and hence I would also argue here everyone is responsible for ethical and responsible AI within the organization and for the use of it. Now, of course, before we get to this point, there are some challenges in incorporating ethics within your organization, and these are broken down. This is based on some academic research, but sort of surveying market participants, particularly developers and ethical developers within organizations. The kind of 3 points or 3 areas that were looked at were, what are the barriers and the challenges? How great is actually familiarity with ethical principles within the development community? And then also, maybe most importantly, if you haven't got the authority or delegated authority within your organization, and if you haven't got the agency to intervene and implement real change, what is the point? So if you look at the barriers and challenges first, you can, I think, see here from the buckets how these been pulled together. The concepts that are underlying this is really usually falling into one of these four big buckets. So it's a lack of knowledge and understanding of how AI works, lack of foresight, AI technology related things. Often we forget that the old GIGO, garbage in, garbage out principle still applies. So all happens really with the data quality that is being fed into that. And if you break that down further, you end up with two categories. One is human related challenges, and that's why I think I enjoy this area so much, because the conduct risk and the culture embedment I've been working in, a lot of that really relates to human challenges. Technology related challenges, yes, they are often data driven. They also, of course, model and algorithm driven, but ultimately it comes down to how you implement all this stuff. And that means it's important to have a development team within your organization that is, I would say, at least reasonably familiar with ethical concepts, the 8 buckets I showed you early on. If you're not familiar with those, and you can see here based on this is a fairly recent survey, 87% of the developers, they didn't really care, because the incentive is to build a shiny new product. The incentive isn't necessary to make sure that product is safe, it respects privacy, fairness, and these kind of things. So you as an organization need to sensitize your developers to make sure they are aligned with your strategic objectives ultimately. And then, of course, you also need to give them authority and the agency to intervene. So the question is, can they escalate? Can they do anything about it or not? And if they can't, then you need to think about it from your almost organizational setup. So old-fashioned management, delegating down, escalating up, but you need to provide escalation routes, and you need to provide proper delegated authorities in order to enable that. Now, the next 3 pages, I want to give you an organizational-wide ethical framework, and then I want to look a little bit at quantitative components and qualitative components. All of these are part of a bigger framework, which I call the HIPACA, or the Human AI Paradigm for Ethics, Conducts, and Risk, which is available via the OECD AI Toolbox. This goes back to research that I started in 2013 and then further refined it in 2015-16. So I built some what I call conduct risk paradigms. One was originally for banks in particular, because that's the domain I'm working in. I then shared this with the United Nations in 2017, and they said to me, if you manage to remove the F word from this, F for financial, then it becomes actually universally applicable. And on the back of that, someone reached out to me and said, actually, now with all this AI stuff going on, there is an opportunity for you to develop your existing paradigm, which is available on the UN website, into something further that might help with the ethical implementation across organizations. So actually, that's a good point. So my starting point was the universal conduct risk paradigm. And if you look at that and compare it with HIPACA, there is actually quite a bit of overlap here. But there's some elements that I think are important if you want to implement a sound ethical framework within your organization. And first one is, you need to think about governance. You need to think about who is responsible for this, who sets the strategic objectives. Typically it's the board, the C-suite. But then you also should think about diverse multi-stakeholder inputs as you build your tool out, and where would that sit? And then you should think about, are you actually having an ethics officer and or an ethics committee? The way this could look like is actually in some of the references there, and I will point you to an organization which I'm aligned with. It's called For Humanity. They have done an awful lot of work in this place, and they've put a paper out about an ethics committee. Now I can see increasingly more organizations talking about this, because there is recognition that needs to be implemented. Then we got also human oversight. I think that's a foundation that cuts across everything. It needs to be in place. The next sort of bucket is ownership and accountability. And you can see already there's a bit of an overlap with the foundational principles we talked about early on. So who is ultimately responsible for the tool or the decisions that are made by the tool? You cannot say, Johan gave the example early on of Little Britain, where the computer says no, and then it's sorry, it's not me, it's the computer made that decision. If you work in an insurance company, bank, you can't say, well, you didn't get the loan, you didn't get the mortgage, you didn't get the credit because the computer said no. Nope, you can't do that. You can't abdicate your responsibility. Ultimately, someone within the organization needs to be responsible, and you need to have a clearly defined oversight by the board. Then from a sort of AI program implementation perspective, Akiva actually gave you a good structure already, how to go about implementing all of this. But you need to be aware that business will have different requirements than compliance. So there's a natural push and pull relationship, and you need to find the right balance where this works for both of them. And ultimately, I think in a financial world, we usually got an audit. You got an internal audit, you got an external audit. I think there's also room for having an audit focus specifically on the implementation of AI within your organization. In addition to that, there should be an independent audit of AI systems, which again is something that for humanity is recommending. And I can see increasing references in market suggesting, yes, we need that, including some of the big techs like OpenAI saying, we need a regulation and we need an independent audit that is actually looking at what we're doing, because otherwise you've got this intrinsic conflict of interest and pressure by internal corporate incentives, and that means you can't have that audit hat on necessarily. But the audit involvement would also include thematic reviews regularly, deep dives into the data, deep dives into the algorithms, deep dives into the hopefully not black box, because if you've got black box, it'll be increasingly difficult to understand what the AI is actually doing. So that's the organizational-wide ethical framework. If we then look at some of the quantitative components that would fit in with that, and I'm sort of speeding up a little bit here, but you can see what are the ethical challenges, the risk, and the misconduct identification. A little bit like the pre-mortem, really, that Akiva mentioned. You begin with the end in mind, you come up with your worst case, you come up with your best case, and you're trying to determine what could go wrong and how can we address that, and also what governance structures can you put in place. Then we need to think about, very important, the data handling, the privacy protection, and also neural data, how that's being used. How are you protecting your IP? How are you protecting your model? And by the way, if you mess this up badly, and we've seen this in the US increasingly now with the FTC, one of the regulatory bodies there have been instances where the FTC came along and said, first of all, you got to delete all your data that's been generated by that model, because you shouldn't have done it in this way. Secondly, you need to get rid of all your algorithms and your models, and you need to close this whole thing down. And so the regulator has got an ability to come in and stop what you're doing in this space if you don't do it properly. The question is then, wouldn't you want to do it properly first, that you feel comfortable with, even if there's no national regulation in the space available? And then if you expand, particularly if you expand globally, you can evidence to the regulators that you've done it the proper way. That's very, very important. Otherwise, it's going to be a costly exercise, and you don't want to be part of the 87% of the failure rate that we've seen in this space. Now, along the data handling, there's also the fairness and the bias mitigation and the inclusion aspect. And that is both bias in the data that's being used, algorithms that are applied, and how is that being mitigated and dynamically controlled, because this is not something you put in place and then it just runs. This is something that is continuously developing, hopefully improving, but also over time you can find that your AI is learning itself bad behaviors, like a badly behaved dog or badly behaved child, and then acts on the basis of that. And that is something you need to avoid. So it needs to be continuously looked at and controlled. And then the question is, another area I've focused on in the past quite a lot is, what are the key ethical indicators? You need to think about key risks, key controls, key performance indicators from an ethical perspective. You need to think about the severity of these things when things can go wrong. You need to consider if there's some indicators that are lacking or leading, and how can you use them in unison with each other. And then also, what are the consequences for the organizations and the individual when things are going on. Finally, some qualitative components. So that includes things such as, what are in your internal standards, policies, procedures, including the level of delegation from the top, the level of escalation to the top from the shop floor, as I would call it, and how can you fostering a strong speaking up culture if things are going wrong. If you have a developer and he sees there's something seriously wrong with your AI, how can you actually flag that up to management to make sure it's being mitigated appropriately? Training, I think, is very important, and you know, particularly if you work in a financial institution, you will be familiar with this. There's always mandatory training, but there's also an element of ongoing mentoring, and you need to measure how effective your training actually is. And I would recommend, don't go this by yourself. Use some of the existing resources, foster some relationships with academic institutions, universities, such as, I think Flame Station has got one with WITS, for instance, or, both Johan and myself are professors at Voxen University. So work with academic institutions to improve the level of effectiveness of your training. Staff-related issues. So obviously AI is fairly new, but there is some good qualifications, external courses out there. Support your staff, make sure they're learning the digital skills they need in a way that suits them as well as you as an organization, because there's no one size fits all. It needs to be tailored to the individual needs of your staff members. And then, of course, external expertise. Often you will find you have to bring in consultants' knowledge and knowledge management. But when you do that, make sure there is some continuity and some handover also. Now, this comes back to my Hypacker system. There is some foundations there as well that I've taken into account wearing my United Nations hat. So it's the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the perspective of human rights, but then there's also some drivers from a corporate perspective. So that's ethical principles, that's the strategic embedment, so the push-pull features. But then, of course, there is also mitigants to some of those, so interactions and dependencies with society, for instance, with regulators, with industry-wide working groups. Lessons learned, pre-mortems and post-mortems are very important, to building up your own knowledge and expertise, to making sure you're not making the same mistakes somebody else has done in the past. So let's talk a little bit about the how and the ethical toolkits to round this whole session off. What is actually available and how should you go about? So there is some external tools, I called them in exclamation marks there, some websites, sources of information that are available. One, if you want to understand what's going on in the global regulatory space across the globe, and also what are the national AI strategies in most countries, I think 75 countries they've done now, is the CAIDP, or Center for AI and Digital Policy. That's one place that you should definitely follow. And again, I'm doing this with my biased hat on because I've been with them for a while as well now, and I've gone through their policy research analyst program. But I can highly recommend them. They're very knowledgeable people, very switched on, very connected as well, and keep an eye on what they're doing. The other one is the UNESCO. The UNESCO has a whole microsite about the ethics of artificial intelligence. If you want to do it properly, bearing in mind there isn't really much else out there right now from a international perspective, then certainly have a look at what these are doing. For Humanity and For Humanity University, there's a lot of free information available. You can also join the For Humanity University and take some of their courses. You could become a certified AI auditor, for instance, but the knowledge you acquire there is highly practical and highly applicable to many organizations. And then finally, in my view, very good as well is that's where Hypecker sits, for instance, but it's the OECD AI Observatory, and they have a separate microsite which they call Catalog of Tools and Metrics for Trustworthy AI. Definitely worth checking out. And again, the link will be in the references for you simply to click on. And then, of course, these were the external tools. Now, internal tools and instruments are equally, if not more important. And coming back to what Akiva said, you need to build out all this stuff within your organization. And one way to do that is you start at the top. You develop your vision, you develop your mission, come up with the strategy, the key strategic objectives, and then you make decisions at the board. That then translates into policies, procedures. Some of these will be internal only. Some of these might even be external. So your customers can see, for instance, what's your privacy policy, what's your data management policy, what's your algorithmic risk management policy, these kind of things. That all needs to be implemented. You need to develop this organizational framework that supports the technology, because without that, you're ending up with a vacuum and it's just hanging there and nobody's responsible. That's not good enough. You need to take full charge of your future in the AI space. And then finally, two things equally important, I think. One is a continuous ethics education of all your staff members, because guess what? This ain't going to go away. If anything, AI is going to take over a lot of areas. We've seen it already. We will see much more of that. And the only way you can tackle that is by keeping your staff informed, keeping them educated, and also keeping them happy in a way that they're feeling comfortable with all this kind of stuff. And then finally, this is something that For Humanity recommends, and equally, I think it's very, very important. Following on what we've seen in the financial markets, where you've got independent audit of players in the financial markets, you should also have an independent audit of artificial intelligence. So AAA systems is AI systems, autonomous systems that you're deploying. That is very, very important. And you need to think about how you within your organization can establish that. Again, a lot of tools available, a lot of references in the last section. And that finally, I guess, brings me to a close. So first of all, if you want to contact me, the easiest way is probably on LinkedIn. I usually come back quite quickly, and equally could reach out through FlameStation if you like. And other than that, I mentioned it here as foundational references for you. There's plenty. The videos are well worth checking out. There's a lot of organizations with really good information about ethics, responsible ethics and AI. There's some of these frameworks I mentioned, some of the toolboxes, databases, some really good books worthwhile reading, and some additional references on my own project at UN level, so the UN AI policy development, particularly focused on products with embedded AI and digital technologies. And here a little bit more focus on some of the emerging technologies, generative AI, and in particular this video, I think it's almost 2 hours. I watched it the other day. It's fascinating, thought-provoking, and it really makes you look at AI with a different lens. So if you get a chance, I would strongly recommend check this out. There's a few more videos from Mo Gavdat on there, but this is really, really deeply inspiring. And if you get an opportunity, please do do educate yourself, because it's digital skills and I think we all need them. So with that in mind, I would like to thank FlameStation very much for having me. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found that a useful and structured way to breaking down a topic that is actually quite challenging when you want to look at all the details. And I'm sure there will be more questions on the back of this in the panel session that's going to follow shortly. So hopefully you've taken something away from here. And yeah, I wish you all the success in, in this new world, which it is. Thank you.